Hi, denizens, and welcome to Morbid Monday, where we cover the macabre, the dark, and the strange. For those who don't know, for those who are unaware, today our beloved hellhound Nico came home to us. We went to the crematorium today and picked him up, and I thought it would be a lovely chance to talk about today on Morbid Monday mourning jewelry from history to today. So I've got quite the slideshow set up today. But first, I want to talk about what exactly mourning jewelry is. Now, mourning jewelry is a type of jewelry that was traditionally made to commemorate the death of a loved one and worn in remembrance of them. It's a tradition steeped in history, often intricate and beautiful, carrying stories of grief, love, and memory across centuries. Mourning jewelry, a tradition that dates back centuries, has seen a resurgence in recent years. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about this craft and how it has evolved over the centuries, particularly in the West. So, we're going to be going over 6 categories today. We're going to be going over ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the 17th to 18th centuries, the Victorian era, and then contemporary pieces that are being made. Okay? So, let's get started, chat. Let's get started. So, starting with ancient Egypt, gems for the dead. And you can see some pieces that I've pictured here. This is a cartouche of Osiris and Isis. I believe it's from the tomb of Tutankhamun. It could be from the tomb of Nefertiti. Some scarabs that were buried with the dead, as well as some ornaments and chest pieces that were buried with the dead. So, in ancient Egypt, jewelry played a significant role in funerary practices and burial rituals. It wasn't really worn by the mourners. It was more of a gift for the deceased. And the Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, the deceased would need their earthly possessions. So they were often buried with their earthly possessions. We have found jars of perfectly edible honey within ancient Egyptian tombs. We have found clothing, we have found jewelry, we have found chessboards, games, even mummified animals to accompany the dead into the afterlife. And this jewelry that we would find, often in tombs, included amulets and charms that were inscribed with protective symbols to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. So they served a purpose, is what I'm saying here. Now, moving onward, not much to say beyond that, is ancient Rome, which existed near the latter half of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom. And primarily, jewelry of the time was about remembering the dead. And you can see here a wall carving of some kind, maybe a frieze of some kind, depicting the burial of what looks to be a young child, and then a ring that has a small carving of someone's face behind amber, which is a really cool thing. You wouldn't expect ancient peoples to be able to do things like this, but it is actually from the Roman period. It is very cool. Now, in ancient Rome, the Romans had their own mourning customs, which included the use of jewelry. Women often wore dark clothes and mourning rings and were hired to join the procession as professional mourners. And they would like beat their chests, scream, cry out, rend their clothes, ripping at their clothes, and just it was a job that you could have back in ancient Rome, is to be a professional mourner. Now, these rings were often just inscribed with the name of the deceased and had phrases like Ave Atque Vale, which is hail and farewell. This is the earliest instance of what would later become known as memento mori, or remember you too shall die. So these are some of the earliest analogs of that we have in history. So moving forward, we are already like halfway through this. I need to slow down. So the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance saw the rise of the memento mori. This is when we start seeing that phrase being tossed around. And this bottom ring is either from France or Belgium and comes from, I believe, the 16th century. Either the 16th or 17th century, tail end of the Renaissance. And as you can see, it's in the form of a book, features a skull and several inlaid gemstones and a very ornate filigree band. Yes, I'm aware it is very ugly, but it is also very, very cool because I believe it looks like the ring actually opens up. So you could probably keep something inside of it too. Very cool. Very cool. And then you see here a ring that features a skull and actually is inscribed with memento mori. And again, this is from like middle of the Renaissance, tail end of the Renaissance. This one up here is a medieval pendant that features the death of one of the martyrs on it, as well as like a coffin in the background. It features a priest figure and then a monk in the front. And that was fairly typical of the Middle Ages. It was to depict saints, religious figures, instead of just skulls. The skulls are definitely more of a Renaissance thing, less of a Middle Ages thing. So if ever you find very, very old rings that feature skulls and say memento mori or our mourning jewelry of, then you can pretty safely assume it's either Renaissance or Georgian or Victorian and not earlier to the Middle Ages. Now then, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Now, during the Middle Ages, mourning jewelry became more subdued. It reflected the era's sober attitude toward death. However, the Renaissance brought a resurgence of interest in commemorative items. So in medieval Europe, the focus was on religious symbols and the afterlife, mostly. It wasn't really on heavy symbolism. It was more on religious symbols and the afterlife. Mourning jewelry from this period often featured crosses, saints, and angels, reflecting the deep Christian faith at the time. Remember, this is the high period of the Roman Catholic Church. This is when the Roman Catholic Church was at its most powerful. Now, the Renaissance era saw a revival of classical themes and a fascination with humanism, which influenced mourning jewelry design. Pieces became more elaborate, incorporating portrait miniatures, cameos and intaligos, and more intricate symbolism. See earlier the use of the skull. The skull was often used as a symbol in Renaissance art to depict either a doctor or somebody that works in the human sciences, or somebody who wishes to remember that they too will die. It was a form of memento mori, and it's actually called that in art history. And this also extended to jewelry. So, moving on to the 17th and 18th centuries. So this is like the Jacobean and the Georgian periods of England, and just the general period of the Reformation in Europe, the Christian Reformation in Europe. So this is where memento mori meets politics. And you can see here, there is a ring that is in the shape of a book with an angel head and a skull. It's engraved on the inside. It looks like it's in either German or Dutch, because I do recognize some of the words here, but it's a little off, so it might be an earlier form of Dutch, or it might be German. And you also see here what looks like onyx or jet ring that is inlaid with what looks like mother of pearl in the shape of a forget-me-not. It has this little band around it in gold of what look like olive leaves or maybe willow branches. And black and gold started becoming very popular for mourning jewelry around the tail end of the 18th century into the Victorian period. So, in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is Stuart and Georgian England, I was a little bit off. Jacobean was France, I believe. The death of Queen Mary II in 1694 and the subsequent widespread mourning set a precedent for the use of mourning jewelry in England, specifically. Now, during this period, mourning jewelry often featured black enamel and detailed engravings. See before. I will switch forward again. I will switch back again. See this ring here. Known as memento mori jewelry, these pieces served as reminders of mortality and the transient nature of life. Very philosophical, very steeped in florography and like different forms of symbolism that were tied to the natural world. When King Charles I of England was executed in the Stuart period, so this is like 1600s, 1700, early 1700s, his supporters would wear jewelry with his image carved into a type of crystal that was called Stuart crystal. And so this is where memento mori jewelry, mourning jewelry, becomes slightly political as well, because typically if you had this kind of jewelry that had his image in it carved out of this specific crystal, it was showing your politics openly. So even this can be slightly political. Yeah. Ugh. The 18th century then saw the rise of neoclassicism, influencing the design of mourning jewelry. So pieces became more refined, there was classical motifs and a focus on simplicity and elegance. Again, we saw that with the later black and gold ring, that we have this very classical olive branch or maybe willow branch design around a black and white engraved stone of a very naturalistic take on a flower, which is the forget-me-not, an obvious mourning flower. So pieces became more refined, featuring classical motifs and a focus on simplicity and elegance, right? So symbolizing the soul's departure from the body, urns became a common feature in mourning jewelry. So you'll see a lot of mourning jewelry, like mourning rings and pendants, feature urns on them. Painted on ivory or enamel, these portraits were often encased in gold or silver frames, sometimes surrounded by pearls, which symbolized tears. All right, now we're getting into the Victorian era, the golden age of mourning jewelry. And I have a hairwork brooch featured here. Got a detail on the hairwork, the woven hairwork of the brooch. And then here is a pendant that was given to Queen Victoria after her husband's death. He had it commissioned for her. And it features an engraving, her personal monogram, his birthday, and then his death day, and then from Albert in remembrance, and his death day again, and then a small inscription, a small personal inscription. So the dead often would commission pieces like this prior to their death to be sent to family members or spouses after death. So that was a fairly normal thing to do. So the Victorian era. Victorian era spans from 1837 to 1901. So it spans several decades. And so the fashion changes a lot. So we're going to see a lot of variation in how the jewelry changes over the years. Now, this marked the peak of mourning jewelry's popularity, driven in large part by Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning for her husband, Prince Albert. Her choice to wear black clothing and mourning jewelry for the rest of her life had a profound impact on mourning customs. Yes, when he died, she went into deep mourning and never left. She viewed him as like her one and only, and she was in mourning for the rest of her life until her death. This period saw the creation of some of the most elaborate and symbolic pieces of mourning jewelry that history has yet shown. Common themes include weeping willows to symbolize grief, doves to symbolize peace, and forget-me-nots to symbolize remembrance. And yes, these were made out of hair. You basically have a list of things that you are given that you need to gather, and you would strategically curl, cut, and then paste hair into shapes like feathers, willows, doves, flowers. It was a lot. They had a lot of different designs. And actually, I might just pull up later a book that goes over how these designs were made, just to show you guys. But anyway, intricately braided or woven hair of the deceased was used to create rings, brooches, and necklaces, often accompanied by inscriptions of love and remembrance. The Victorian era's fascination with death and mourning was part of a broader cultural context that included elaborate funerary practices and a heightened interest in symbolism. So, what do I mean by that? Well, the Victorian era basically figured out how to make everything as needlessly complicated as possible. And that includes funerary practices. Traditionally speaking, when you died, what would happen would be your family would take your body, wash it, dress it, do your hair, and if makeup was a thing, then you would also get makeup done. And you would be laid out in state in either your bedroom or in the family's parlor. And this was done for about 3 days and was called the wake. And it was primarily so that they could make sure that you were actually dead before they buried you. This often included, in some cultures, covering the windows with cloth, covering the mirrors with cloth, and having a single candle lit day and night through the entire period. And then what they would do is the casket man would come in and put you in your casket. You would be carried off to the graveyard and then buried with rites. The Victorian era decided, okay, but that doesn't seem very civilized. So we're going to make it much more complicated. And this is actually where we see the advent of the funeral parlor and morticians. And often morticians would hire women to comfort the family, because often preparing the dead for burial was women's work. It was traditionally something that women would do. They would be the ones to take the body and wash it and dress it and everything. So a lot of morticians in the Victorian period would hire women for the family's comfort, and she would be there to reassure family members that their loved ones were being cared for at the funerary home, at the funeral parlor. Yeah. So, moving onward, we are finally at the last part. Today, we have a revival of memorial. And you can see some modern options for how people create mourning jewelry today. Now, one that is pretty well known is that you can get a loved one's ashes compressed under heat and turned into diamonds or other gemstones and then set into some form of jewelry as a sort of memento mori that can be worn just as is without anybody knowing. JoJo fans be like, diamond? Diamond? Yeah, exactly. Diamond. Another option is the revival of hair work. Hair work has seen a revival too. You can see here, this is a pendant under resin of hair that has been worked into the shape of a tree. Glittery spangles have been added into the background and into the tree as though it is a starry night sky. Another very popular option, I saw a lot of these when we went to go and pick up Nico today, is ash necklaces where you're able to have an urn around your neck and you keep the ashes of your loved one inside of your necklace so that it's always with you. That is a very popular option now, and I've seen a lot of people do that. I personally think that's a little weird to me, personally. I just am not comfortable with it. Mostly because I'm worried that you can't wear these things. You can't wear these urn necklaces into the shower. And I'm a very forgetful person, so I'll forget to take off my necklaces before I go into the shower. I've had this happen with countless lockets where water gets inside and ruins whatever's inside. So I would worry about this getting wet and then the ashes inside being clumped together, and just it doesn't appeal to me at all. But whatever, if that's your thing, that's your thing. So on to the actual history. So the early 20th century saw a decline in the popularity of mourning jewelry. It started falling out of favor around the early 20th century. So pretty much after the Victorian period, around like the 19 teens, people just stopped really doing this. The world was changing rapidly. Modernization was a thing. People were getting more and more into looking towards the future instead of looking at the past. And the sober traditions of the Victorian era began to feel out of step with where people were at in society at the time. World War I and the subsequent societal shifts that happened afterward also ended up playing a role in changing attitudes toward just death and mourning. A lot of people did not have bodies to mourn. So their loved ones were basically photographs and not much else. And that did affect a lot how people would mourn their dead. If they didn't have a body, it was a lot harder to mourn their death. The elaborate rituals of the past got replaced by more restrained practices in the early 20th century. And then with the rise of evangelicism and such, we saw a lot of people start to actually fear death, and death started becoming very taboo, especially with practices like embalming and sealed caskets. It made it so that people were not used to death in the same way that the Victorians were, where death was very personal and often took place within the home. It's a very different attitude because death was not quite so personal. Unfortunately, the advent of the funeral parlor and the mortician ended up detaching people further from death instead of making it more comfortable for people to face death. So, today, as in late 20th and 21st centuries, where we are now, mourning jewelry has found a niche market among collectors and enthusiasts. I can speak. My tongue. I'm sorry, chat. I have a canker sore on like the underside of the tip of my tongue, and it's making it very hard to talk. I probably should not have streamed today because between feeling ill and having a canker sore that makes it very hard to speak, I probably should have just been like, you know what? We probably shouldn't do this. But we pushed through anyway, chat. I pushed through for you guys because I made a promise, and I and I try my damnedest to keep my promises. Anyway, antique pieces from the Victorian era are highly sought after and valued for their historical significance and unique beauty. Personally, I find it kind of weird when people wear antique mourning jewelry just because it's such a personal thing. And like, if it's not your person, if it's not one of your dead, it just kind of feels odd to me. I don't know. That's just me. That's just me. Maybe you aren't bothered by it. Maybe that's just you. I just personally find it kind of weird to wear the jewelry of dead people that commemorates dead people that you have no connection to. That's just me. There's also a growing interest in contemporary mourning jewelry, with artists and designers creating modern pieces that play homage to traditional themes while incorporating new materials and techniques. See the previous slide right here. We see resin instead of using crystal or glass to encase these things. There's glitter, which glitter did not exist until like the late Victorian period. At least not the way that we think of glitter. Again, we have urns as necklaces becoming a thing. We did not have the technology back then, but we have it now to be able to turn your loved one's ashes into a diamond or whatever gemstone you want. So these are the new techniques that I'm talking about. And I outline it here. Ashes can now be placed in a pendant urn or compressed into gemstones and made into jewelry. This is fairly new. We did not have this back in the Victorian period or prior to the Victorian period. Most lockets and things were meant to hold a lock of hair and a portrait of the deceased, and not much else. Hair work is seeing a resurgence in popularity, either behind resin or in a locket-type pendant. I've seen a bunch of those pendants where they're like plexiglass or acrylic or resin. Some are even glass, and they kind of create like a shadow box that you can put a little tuft of your pet or your loved one's hair into. So that is a very popular choice. And I actually considered that at one point, but I wanted something a little bit fancier, a little bit more Victorian period looking. Especially since both of my dogs are Victorian dogs. They reached their popularity via the Victorian period, and Queen Victoria even owned a bunch of rough collies. And she really popularized the rough collie as a breed and started codifying the standard of the breed during that period. So I felt it was appropriate. It is very apt to turn my poor beloved Nico into a piece of hairwork mourning jewelry that really evokes that era. I thought that that was very appropriate. So that's pretty much all I've got for you guys today. If you guys are curious at all about mourning jewelry, I've got more hairwork pieces up here that really show you like how they used curlers and how they used cut pieces of hair to form things, or how they wove them into these like tablets that you can then put inside of a locket. Anyway, if you guys have any questions on like how hair work was done, or what types of mourning jewelry were available at different periods, what different symbols mean, let me know. I'm open to questions now, chat. I know Belgian asked me if I wanted to like get like gemstones or get like a urn necklace, and I told him no. I was just like, that's a little bit weird to me. I don't like that. But I am very open to hair work. I like the hair work. I think that is very cool. I think it is very interesting how they made these things. I need to take my headphones off because they're starting to hurt my ears, which means I am going to have to switch to just chatting. Give me a second. There we are. There we are, chat. There we are. So anyway, as I was saying, actually, I'll go back to capture. We'll go on back to game capture. So, I think it's very cool how hair work is made. I've actually looked up a few old Victorian and Edwardian manuals on how hair work was done and how they would selectively curl and cut the hair to be able to create different motifs and different images. Like you can see here, this curled lock here was called a fan. You would fan out the hair and then curl it so that it would create this kind of swoop. This little branch here looks like wheat, but it would be called a feather or similar, like kind of motif. And it's done by gently curling a single piece of hair and then taking one end of that piece of hair and cutting it into little tiny sections, and then using tweezers, and they called it gum at the time, but it was basically glue. They would put glue out onto a non-stick palette, and then they would arrange it so that it would look like a feather or something, and then once it dried, they would pry it off of the palette and then put it in with the rest of the hair work. This could be hair. It looks like it might be hair, but it also could be gold wire. You can see gold wire being used down here on this lighter colored fan. So wire was also used for these techniques. You would also see people take sections of hair and glue them in a sort of loom pattern where strips would be parallel. And then they would weave in other strips. So they would create a warp and a weft and would weave it together into basically a small section of fabric. And then once everything was glued together, they would lift it off of the palette, and then they would put it inside of a locket or inside of a brooch or some other piece of jewelry that was able to display it. And you can see on the other side of this locket, there's a portrait of whoever's hair this is. So that was also a very common thing that was done. And you can still buy things like this. This one is an antique that I found on Etsy. And this one is actually made by a modern day artisan who has revived the technique. So absolutely possible to get Victorian technique in a modern piece. You don't have to go with more experimental methods like this. So honestly, where do I stand on the whole mourning jewelry thing? I am not completely against it. I actually think that it's very cool. I think it's very interesting. I think that it's something that we really should revive. Certain forms of it kind of just are odd to me, but I can see how it would bring comfort to somebody that is in mourning, especially since, I've seen quite a bit of death in the past few years since starting VTubing, and it does kind of speak to me. But I can also see why people would be kind of leery about it. Maybe you just are terrified of the thought of dying. Maybe you just find it very weird to be wearing the ashes of your loved one. Maybe you find it weird that some people keep hair from their loved ones. Maybe you just find the entire idea of jewelry for mourning tacky. Who knows? But I want to thank you guys for showing up for this today. I really appreciate those of you who showed up. And to my lurkers, I know there's at least 2 lurkers out there. I know there's at least 2 of you guys lurking. I'm trying this week to get back onto the grind set and trying to get back into streaming every day that I have scheduled again, because there was a good chunk there where I was doing really well, and it kind of all got derailed last week. So I'm attempting to be like, okay, this upcoming week is a new week. We can try again. And so tomorrow I have it's a long week of gaming, chat. So tomorrow we're going to be continuing Online Obsession, mostly because Belgian is invested in the male love interest. He thinks that he's a cool looking dude. Then we're going to be replaying Scarlet Hollow on hard mode, because Scarlet Hollow releases a new chapter. We're getting chapter 5 after like 3 years on Valentine's Day. So I want to replay Scarlet Hollow as much as I can and get that finished before Scarlet Hollow Chapter 5 releases. And we're going to be playing it on hard mode, which means we get more attribute slots, but the choices get harder. So we are going to be playing that on Thursday and Friday. So I want to thank you guys for showing up. I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much for showing up. I know this was very short, but again, I'm not feeling well today, and I'm still getting over a lot of stuff. Hey, dude, see, I told you guys. I knew that some of you guys were lurking. But yeah, I want to thank you guys for showing up. I will have this VOD up tomorrow for sure. I need to post... I think my husband is a fucking fish person tonight. I didn't get a chance to post it, I don't think. Let me double check that, actually. Let me double check myself before I wreck myself. Let's see what I have available right now. Videos. Or not that channel. There we go. Oh, I did put it up. Okay. Yeah, I have part 1 up. I don't have part 2 up. So I'm going to be posting that tonight. And then we will have today's Morbid Monday posted tomorrow. For sure. Especially since I have time now to post, to cut and edit it enough so that it will be ready for posting as a VOD. So I want to thank you guys for showing up. I love you guys when you're old here. I want to thank you guys so much. I appreciate it for putting up with my verbal flubs because of my tongue being injured. I want to thank you guys for being patient with me for canceling stream last week. I want to thank everybody who sent well wishes and condolences to me in Belgium. We really appreciated it. I feel a lot more at peace now that he's finally back home with us. So hopefully we can begin the healing process, and I will be able to maintain the schedule. So, because remember, the schedule, chat, the schedule. We must maintain the schedule. So, I love you guys when you're old here. I want to thank you guys for showing up. Memento Mori.